Testing? Okay, yes. Okay. All right. Well, just to continue, we couldn't exist without all the support we get from you as the community, all of you who've become members in the museum, and certainly the city and county of Broomfield, the Rotary Club, and so many other groups who help support our organization. Just a quick reminder again, if you haven't signed in at either one of our sign-in, please do. That documents people actually visited us. Time to turn off or mute your cell phones. Yeah, I'm going to have to do that too. If you haven't become a museum member, please do. We would love to have you become a member. Make sure you get all our latest newsletters and stuff, and you get our free admission, and again, coffee and donuts. So what more could you ask? Any donations you'd like to do help cover our operation. And to give you just a quick reminder, we have 2 new museum exhibits upstairs. Our very own Flint Whitlock, who is our marvelous historian and everything, has the new exhibit on Operation Overlord and the D-Day landing. So if you haven't seen it, please go upstairs for that. And then in the hallway, we have a marvelous exhibit of paintings by Vietnam veteran Noah Webb. And actually, he's painted all sorts of other stuff too. But as part of our Art Illery exhibit, where any veteran who has any sort of artwork would like to display it, we'll set up for them. So anyway, we have a collection of the paintings Noah did based on his experience in Vietnam. Again, obviously, Memorial Day is coming up. We hope we'll see all of you up there at Broomfield Commons Park. Ceremony starts at 11. Music, speaker, in fact, our very own Bear Owen, Colonel Owen, will be our guest speaker for this event. And then June 15th, our Flag Day retirement ceremony. Again, here out front, food provided by North Metro Fire, and come help us prepare an enormous amount of flags that need to be prepped for final retirement. So if you have a good pair of sharp scissors, bring them along. And we have plenty of flags that need some help here. Just want to highlight our future CNCs. We actually are going to have 3 in June. Normally I try and keep it at 2, but we just happen to have some great opportunities. 8 June, Josh Ingram. In fact, Josh was in the back here. He's here, a young student actually up at Front Range Community College, and he's going to talk about an article he's having published called The Unraveling. And I think that'll be kind of fascinating because it's kind of taking another look at the, oh, there he is. Josh, he's in the back, be our speaker. And this will be a special talk on the fall of the Soviet Union, but also the question, which is intriguing, is if Gorbachev hadn't been overthrown with the direction he was going, could it have changed the whole direction of the Soviet Union? 15 June, Don Skanga. Don's one of our volunteers, had served, well, both in the Air Defense and the Signal Corps, and he has a special love for the Signal Corps, but also he's learned how to do electronic publishing, e-books, and he's done several, excellent, and so he wanted to talk a little bit about his latest one, which is coming out, about the history of the Signal Corps. And for those of us, we always thought the engineers were the most important, but you got to be able to talk to each other too. And then what we really needed to do, 22nd of June, Chief Master Sergeant, I guess, Charles Abadoka from Space Force Branch Buckley is going to come up and tell us what the heck is this new branch that we have as part of our armed forces. None of us really know much of anything about it. So I think that's going to be really important for us. So again, June, we got lots of stuff going on. And again, this also is the day for our Flag Day ceremony. So you can come in, have a nice coffee and donut, listen to a great talk, and then we immediately move out front to do our flag retirement ceremony, which have music, a speaker, and lots of flags. And hot dogs, too, yes. Let's see. Okay, so that, I think, is about it for me, and I'm sure you're happy about that. Our first speaker of this thing is going to be Flint, so why don't you come on up.
Thank you. Okay. While Mike gets the PowerPoint going here, I just wanted to, first of all, welcome all of you. It's great to have a full house and some overflow in the library as well. And it's so nice to see some young people here today. Some, future historians, perhaps? That's wonderful. Come here and learn about what our country has done in over 200 years and some of the significant events. You might notice that I'm wearing a shirt that says 75th Anniversary of D-Day. I have a bigger sign on the back. For the last couple of decades, the Smithsonian has invited me to go over to England and France and guide a tour of the battlefields. And next Thursday, I'm going to be leaving to head over there and do the 80th anniversary commemoration in Normandy and certain sites in England that pertain to the Operation Overlord. I also want to have a commercial message here. This is my newest book. It's called D-Day, The Invasion That Saved Civilization. It just came out, I think, last month. I have a few copies over here. If you'd like to purchase one and have me sign it, I'll be happy to do that. It's only $20. $30 if I don't sign it, so you get a slight break there. And then also, as Mike mentioned, in Veterans Life magazine, which it says here somewhere on the cover, celebrating the Northern Colorado veteran community. So that would be all of us. And our mission fits right in with their publication, and they have an article in this May-June issue about D-Day. It's short but very good. I wrote it, so I know it's good. No, just kidding. I want to talk a little bit before Don takes the stage here about Major General Raymond O. Barton. General Barton was the commanding officer of the 4th Infantry Division that landed on D-Day at Utah Beach. General Barton also was born in Colorado, so he's got a connection here. And for the last at least 2 decades, the 4th Infantry Division has been stationed at Fort Carson. So we have a lot of local connections between him and the division and the state. I want to talk first about his father, Conway Oldham Barton Jr., who was born in 1856 on the family plantation in Texas. His family had 157 slaves because, of course, at that time, Texas was part of the Confederacy. Conway had 3 older brothers who fought on the Confederate side, and maybe Conway would have also had he been older. He attended the University of Virginia, 1876, 1877, and at that time you didn't have to go to law school to become a lawyer, and I think all you had to do was what they call read for the law. And so I guess through book learning, he decided he could become a lawyer, and he moved to Milam County, Texas, opened a law practice. He married Mary Blanche Crow, who died, unfortunately, at an early age in 1882, and they had 2 daughters. He got remarried to Carrie Motion of Illinois. They had 6 children, Raymond and his brother Percy. They had 4 other children who died in infancy. He moved to Granada, Colorado, in southeast Colorado, and opened a law practice there. If you're wondering where Granada is, it's down kind of in the southeast corner of the state.
Grenada.
Grenada?
Yeah.
Well, I think of a grenade as something you throw, but I'm using the Spanish pronunciation.
They butcher it down there.
Grenada or Granada.
Tomato, tomato.
At that time, in the late 1800s, it was a prosperous cattle ranching area. And during its most prosperous era, two years, 1873 to 75, there are 4 saloons, 3 dance halls, and 1 gambling den. Here's the train station. It was also a booming railroad town. And here's a close-up of the station. Some pictures of the early buildings. In the upper left is a hotel. Oh no, that's the bank. This is the hotel. That's a schoolhouse, a church, and the railroad bridge over the Arkansas River, or is it Arkansas River? I want to make sure I get my pronunciation right. And here's the town today. I think its boom days are long gone. Here's beautiful downtown Grenada. And you might recall that in 1942, the government established one of, I believe, 10 or 12 Japanese American internment camps around the country. This was probably the furthest east that the camps went. It was called Camp Amachi, where several thousand Japanese Americans who had been uprooted from their homes along the West Coast because the government thought they might pose a security risk, and they might have more loyalties towards Japan than they did towards the U.S. And one of the great injustices that has been perpetrated on American citizens, I think. So this was a camp as it looked then. In 1892, Conway moved his family from Grenada, down to Texas, and he became a judge there. And in 1895, 3 years later, he moved to Indian Territory, which was later named Oklahoma. And there, Raymond attended high school in Ada, Oklahoma. Here's some shots of booming Ada, Oklahoma, which is a little bit more prosperous looking than perhaps Grenada. He was elected mayor of Ada, or Ada, and he served a term 1906 to 1908, and he became a county judge in 1910. Well, his son Raymond graduates as valedictorian from Ada High School. You got me going now. Thank you, Theron.
That wasn't me.
Oh,
It was me.
it was you, okay.
The guy next to me.
You in the library. Go to the library.
That's where I'm from.
Oh, okay. Ray receives an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And in his class are several men who become prominent officers in World War II. Wade Hayslip, who commanded, I believe it was the 85th Division and 15th Corps. Terry Allen, who commanded the 1st Infantry Division and the 104th Division. And Patty Flint, who is no relation to me, but I wish he were, because then I'd be named Flint. Unfortunately, well, Hayslip and Allen become generals, but Patty Flint is killed by a sniper. He's a regimental commander for the 39th Regiment of the 9th Division. He's killed by a sniper in Normandy, so he doesn't get a very long life. Behind Ray Barton are General Eisenhower and Omar Bradley in the class of 1915. That's been described as the class that the stars fell on, because so many graduates at that time went on to become generals. And he becomes the valedictorian of his class at West Point, just like he was at Ada High School. Although his sports at West Point were boxing and wrestling, he somehow acquires the nickname Tubby that stays with him for the rest of his life. I suppose it's like calling a guy who's 6'6" shorty or whatever. But this is an interesting photo of the Letterman, the athletes at West Point. And if you look at it closely, it looks like it's been heavily retouched. And some of the heads look like they've been cut out of other pictures and put onto bodies in this picture. But I think this guy is Barton. I looked at all of the cadets in this picture, and that one looks the most like the portrait of Barton. So Barton serves in World War I, but he doesn't see action because his unit does not arrive in France until after the war ends. However, he commands a battalion of the 4th Division during the occupation of Germany from 1919 to 1923. While stationed in Koblenz, Germany on occupation duty, Barton, then a major, marries Claire Fitzpatrick of New York on January 31st, 1921 in Paris. And I've searched the internet, every resource I could find, and I cannot find a picture of his wife. So you'll have to take this as gospel.
How did she get to, how'd she get to Paris? How'd they meet?
Yeah, that's another mystery. I'm sure if I find the photo of her, I can find out how they met. It may be that he had known her in New York when he was at West Point, and they carried on a correspondence romance, and she may have sailed over to Paris and they got married there. I don't really know the story on that. And during the interwar years, he has various assignments, mostly administrative, and so we're waiting for, the next phase. The 4th Infantry Division is reactivated before World War II breaks out on June 1st, 1940 as an experimental unit, and it was called the 4th Motorized Division at Fort Benning, Georgia. Then December 7th of 41 comes along, and the U.S. is thrust into the conflict. On July 3rd of 42, Barton becomes the commander of the 4th Infantry Division at age 53, and the division is sent to Fort Gordon, Georgia, and that's where they did most of their training. He comes into the position with a reputation as an exacting and demanding leader. One 4th Division colonel later described him as a very strict disciplinarian who commanded his division with an iron hand. His no-nonsense attitude is made clear when he first addresses the officers and men of the division on the day he assumes command. "I am your leader," he said. "In the not-too-distant future, we will be in battle. When bullets start flying, your minds will freeze and you will act according to habit. In order that you develop the right habits, training discipline must be strict. I know that 90% of you want to cooperate. I'll take care of the other 10%. So you know where this guy stands, right? His assistant division commander in the 4th is Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt, the son of the Rough Rider president and the 5th cousin of the current occupant of the White House, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been he was the assistant division commander also of the 1st Division under Terry Allen. And this is a monument to the 4th Division at Fort Gordon, and it talks about its creation and the battles that it fought in. Shortly before going overseas, the 4th Infantry Division goes to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for advanced training. And I always thought that Fort Jackson was named for Stonewall Jackson, but it's actually named for Andrew Jackson, which is why it didn't fall into the renaming of Army posts to get rid of the Confederate generals' names. So Fort Jackson is Andy Jackson's namesake. And there at Fort Jackson, they have a monument here to the 4th Division that talks a little bit about its history. On January 18th of 1944, the 4th sailed from New York to England, arriving in Liverpool on January 26, 1944, just one day before my wife in the corner back there was born. So I don't know why I brought that up.
He'll pay for that.
No doubt.
For a ride home, Flint.
Can I ride with you, Bear?
You can.
Thank you. So the division is built today. All of the American divisions that went to England prior to D-Day are stationed all around England in camps and villages and whatnot. The division, in this case, with the 4th Division, is billeted in villages in Devonshire with the headquarters near Exeter, at Tiverton, or Tiverton, as you want to pronounce it. But during pre-invasion exercises, called Exercise Tiger, at Slapton Sands on the South Devon coast, in April of 44, German E-boats, these were motor torpedo boats, entered the exercise area and attacked the ships that were conducting the landing there, and killing and wounding over 900 men of the division. They lost more men in this attack than happened during the actual D-Day invasion. It was quite a tragedy, and it was covered up for many years after the war. We have British Field Marshal Montgomery addressing the 4th Infantry Division shortly before Overlord begins. And over here, this gentleman with the helmet, that's Roosevelt. And here's Barton in the overseas cap standing next to him. Here's some men of the 4th Division on their way to Normandy. This must be a later wave because most of these guys are smiling. And I don't think there were many smiles in the first wave that went in. 4th Infantry coming ashore at Omaha Beach on June 6th.
Utah. You said Omaha.
Thank you. Or it's Utah. Sometimes pronounced Omaha. What am I doing up here?
Having fun.
So this is a very famous picture of the 4th Division at Utah Beach. There's a concrete seawall there that many of the troops went and took cover behind before they began going up over the sand dunes and inland. Here's General Barton there on the left at Utah Beach. Here's some of the men of the division moving inland. They finally, after clearing out the Cherbourg Peninsula, move back going east, and they take part in the liberation of Paris. There's a 4th Division soldier there being warmly welcomed by a Parisian. Here's General Barton at the wheel of his own Jeep, and it's got his name on here, Barton. So nobody else uses the Jeep, I presume. And he's talking to Colonel Canham over on the left there, head of the 22nd Regimental Combat Team, during the fighting along the Siegfried Line in September of 44. The 4th took part in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest in November and December of 44. And during the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, Barton gave his belt to a medic who used it as a tourniquet for a wounded soldier. And he's here presenting that medic with the Silver Star. I looked all over for pictures of General Barton, and he's one of the least photographed generals of the Second World War. And here he is talking to some of the men during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 44. War correspondent Ernest Hemingway was a close friend of Barton's, and he reported on the division's wartime exploits, and he told Barton, "You have one of the greatest divisions in American military history." But in December of 44, while the Battle of the Bulge was kind of winding down, Barton had to relinquish his command due to serious health problems. I think he had a heart condition. And the 4th was taken over by Major General Harold Blakely, who was an armor division commander. Then Barton went back to the States. He died on the 27th of February, 1963, and he's buried at Fort Gordon, Georgia, which is now known as Fort Eisenhower. And this is his tombstone there. Those of you who have seen The Longest Day, how many have seen The Longest Day? Okay, just about everybody.
40 years.
Yeah, well, you can still find it. Interestingly enough, Edmund O'Brien played Barton, and Henry Fonda played Roosevelt. And you can see they look nothing like the real people. This is one of the Hollywood, features of let's not make anybody look like they really did. And so we conclude the saga of Major General Raymond Barton, and I'd like to now turn it over to, we're doing a tag team presentation here. I'll turn it over to my cohort, Don Cygan. Take it away, Don.
Thank you, Flint.
Thank you.
You're going to stick around for some Q&A afterwards,
Yeah.
right? Okay, all right. Welcome, everybody, and let's see if I can get this up and running on mine. I'm assuming that the next group is going to be...
We already saw that slide.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to see it again backwards.
I think I'll have to do a little moving around here, so if you folks have a second. There we go. Slideshow. Shouldn't be that hard, should it? There we go. Okay. So, Flint did a wonderful job of talking about a unique Colorado connection that we have here with General Barton and the 4th Infantry Division, as he mentioned, of course, based at Fort Carson right now. I've always wondered why they can't bring the 10th Mountain back to Colorado, but oh well, anyway. Probably because the 4th has taken up all their barracks. But I was asked to give kind of a brief overview of D-Day, Operation Overlord. And when they asked me to do that, I thought to myself, it kind of reminded me of like one of those school assignments you had where your teacher goes and says, condense War and Peace into a one-page report, Cliff Notes or something like that. And for myself, I was like, wow, this was such a massive undertaking. It was huge. And part of what we have here, I think if you ask me, is with the 80th anniversary is a very important and crucial opportunity for us to extend this information, this history, to younger generations. So I am happy to see that there are some younger people in the audience, as Flint mentioned, and I encourage the rest of you, if you have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whatever, to maybe take a little time this Memorial Day and the upcoming June 6th 80th anniversary celebration to go ahead and remind them of this sacrifice that was made during a very difficult time. So this thing, as we know, is huge, momentous, and surely one of the major events of the Second World War. Studs Terkel, very famous author, described World War II as the good war. And although we could, as historians, maybe debate about how much good there was intrinsically in the war, we could sit there and say that basically this was a war where we definitely had, as the United States of America, a very concrete objective to defeat what, for all practical purposes, could be described as evil on the continent of Europe. And of course, that was Hitler's Nazi Third Reich. So the invasion, invading Normandy, invading France, our first major invasion of the European continent to reclaim the continent, to liberate those countries that were being subjugated by the Nazis, was really important. And an interesting quote here from Stephen Ambrose. Some of you know the author, of course, who wrote Band of Brothers, D-Day, a bunch of great books. At the core, the American citizen soldiers knew the difference between right and wrong. And they didn't want to live in a world in which wrong prevailed. So they fought and won, and we, all of us, living and yet to be born, must be forever profoundly grateful. And over here I have a copy of Dwight Eisenhower's very famous notice that he sent out to the troops just prior to the invasion. And in that, I think one of the crucial words, the phrases that he uses, is he describes this as the Great Crusade. For 5 years, Nazi Germany and her allies had occupied and controlled most of the European continent. By 1944, the Allied powers had made strategic gains, most notably in North Africa. We had expelled the Germans from North Africa and the Italians. And we had moved up the Italian boot, but that really, as we'll see here a little bit later, had not worked out very well. And in the East, remember, we did have an ally, a communist ally, the Soviet Union, and they had started to turn the tide of the war in their favor at Stalingrad. That was a huge turning point in 1942, 1943. And they were on the offensive now, pushing ever westward. So from both sides. In 1943, we had the Tehran Conference, where we had the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. The Big Three, as they were called. And they met and discussed about this second front to fight the Nazis. The idea being here, when are the British, when are the United States forces going to return to Europe and liberate Europe from the Western side, since the Soviets had been taking the bulk of the fighting throughout 1941 to 1944. Tremendous casualties. Some estimates put that at over 27 million Soviets who were killed during World War II. So Stalin, as much as we could say, you know, he's not exactly the most lovable person in history, did have a very valid point. And that was that the Soviet Union was bearing basically the brunt of this fighting against Nazi Germany. And his push to FDR and Churchill was, we need to get the second front opened up. And it wasn't just the Soviets. It's interesting, if you look at any sort of information about Great Britain during this time, the British people, you'll even see graffiti on walls that said, second front now. The British people were also calling for this return to the continent and to expel the Nazis. Allied forces had been training in Great Britain for just such an invasion. Since 1942, we had been sending army forces over to Britain, and they had been doing extensive training. But really, the time and the place of where this invasion was going to take place was kind of a point of contention amongst the Allied leaders. Supplies, weaponry, command, support. Imagine how much of a buildup there was for this. The largest seaborne invasion ever in history. So getting all of this material, everything from what we like to call in the military, beans to bullets, food, equipment, gasoline, fuel, weaponry, ammunition, all of this, and of course the personnel, the troops. And that was necessary if we were going to attack and crack Fortress Europe, which we'll talk about in a second. This wasn't just a beach holiday. This was going to be an invasion. Now, while they were over in England, as we know, lots of training taking place. In this photograph here, you'll see a guy with a bazooka training troops on how to use it up against that concrete target in the background there. You'll see the buildup of tanks, half-tracks, trucks, artillery over here, all this stuff taking up acres and acres of land in Great Britain. But the other situation we had too is we had almost 1 million American troops over in Great Britain. And there's a culture shock there, a little bit of a culture shock going on. Remember that a vast number of the young men in Great Britain are already in the service. And they're overseas, either in Italy or in Africa or over in Burma or places like this around the world. And there are a lot of young British women around and a lot of young American men. So this is where we had a little bit of a culture clash here, and there were some situations that became very uncomfortable, as we know. But there were a lot of marriages. I guess 60,000 British women married American GIs during this time. So that's interesting, you know? And of course, many of them immigrated after the war to the United States. But many of the British who were not too happy about this being invaded by Americans on their island described them as overpaid, oversexed, and darn it, over here. You know, they couldn't wait for him to leave. And that might have been part of the reason why maybe they were really anxious for this second front, right? Yeah. Get these guys out of here. Yes. Now is the time. The Italian campaign, which Winston Churchill had hoped would have been the soft underbelly of Europe, really had turned out to be anything but. Any of you have ever been to Italy, you know that the center of Italy is a massive mountainous ridge. And this ridge line was very easy for German and Italian forces when they were with the Axis to hold off American advances up the Italian boot, the peninsula. And especially in 44 at the Gustav Line and in Monte Cassino, they put up fierce resistance, and that was bogging down. So that did not seem to be like the way to get into Europe. And there was even more of a call then for the second front to open up in France. Secrecy was key. And you have to recall that if this thing is going on for years and years and it's involved many people, we know this as military veterans. We know sometimes the more people you get involved in something, the more risk you have of what? Yeah, exactly. Yes, or that too. Yeah. But security was a big one. You know, the more people that know this stuff, loose lips, sink ships, all that kind of stuff. So the amount of secrecy here was amazing. And it actually got to the point where as they get closer and closer to D-Day, June 6th, they go ahead and quarantine the Allied camps, all these places where the Americans are, and the British too. They basically get turned in almost like prison camps. And if you've ever talked to some of the World War II veterans who were involved in this, there's some interesting stories about how some of the guys snuck out to see their British girlfriends at the last minute. And yeah, very dangerous, but yeah. The French resistance played a huge part in this preparation for the invasion too, and sometimes don't get as much credit. But recall that they were kind of on standby. They had been, of course, fighting the Nazis, their occupiers, for quite some time, but they were alerted by special codes to prepare for this invasion. And also we had what were called Jedburgh teams, and these were OSS. These were the forerunner of the CIA. And specialist US and British commando troops, secret agents, so to speak, and French, were parachuted in before D-Day to work close cooperation with these French resistance, the Maquis, and set up ways to throw a real wrench in the monkey works, if you will, the Nazis during the invasion. We'll talk about that a little bit too. Here you can see a photograph of the key Allied generals who were in charge of planning this operation. Dwight Eisenhower, of course, in the center, Bernard Montgomery, Omar Bradley, many other famous names we know, some of who Flint had mentioned too. So deception. How do you keep something this big a secret? How do you disguise a massive buildup like those photos I showed you of weapons and men and material and ammunition, all this kind of stuff, from getting out there and then the Germans finding out what's going on? Well, first off, basically they had given up on the aspect of trying to keep it totally top secret. The Germans were still flying reconnaissance flights at this time over Great Britain, so they knew that they were going to be able to see this stuff. There's only so much you can do to hide it. But what they figured is if we create a deception and maybe make them think that we're going to use this to invade somewhere else than where they would think we're going to invade. And this was a very complicated job. And there's some great books about this. I won't go into too much detail. As I mentioned, I'm trying to kind of cover the basics here. But the Germans knew there was going to be invasion. The main thing they didn't know was when and where. So we could take those two, when and where, and we could use those as our deception, since they already know the invasion is coming. We created an entire fake army. It was called the 1st U.S. Army Group. It was based at Dover, and this was genius. The general that was put in charge of this by Eisenhower was none other than George S. Patton. The Germans are looking at George S. Patton. They know he's the best general that we have. And they're figuring if he's going to be in charge of an army, that army has got to be something that's going to be used for D-Day, right? It is a big, important army. What they didn't know is this army was totally fake. There was nothing there. They actually, on Dover, set up inflatable tanks, wooden artillery, and even some dummies of tents and men. And I understand, I read a story where they actually had, if a reconnaissance flight came over or German spies were around, they actually had a mess tent set up at one of these places with a line of dummies going to get their chow. So it would look real. It would look like they're feeding these guys and everything. So this was a great little game that they played, and it worked. The Germans took this bait. They figured that this invasion was going to come from Dover. Patton was going to be in charge of it, and it was going to come to the closest point of France, the Pas de Calais. So this would be the invasion site, not Normandy. The Germans thought this would be the place. By the way, they actually designed a patch for this fake army. That's it right there. The Atlantic Wall, what came to be known as the Atlantic Wall, the German defenses, in 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, so they've got their best general too, the Germans do, in charge of building these defenses for Festung Europa, known as Fortress Europe. That gives you an idea of how extensive these defenses were. Over 800,000 tons of concrete, tens of thousands of mines, land mines, and also sea mines, beach obstacles, pillboxes, gun emplacements along 3,000 some miles of the coastline from basically the French-Spanish border all the way up to Norway. But Rommel should have read Frederick the Great, and I assume he did. He was German. But Frederick the Great, remember, had the very famous quote of, if you try to defend everything, you defend what? Nothing. So this was the problem with trying to defend a coastline like that. And again, this plays back to the Americans in their hands of where are you going to invade? So it's great to have this wonderful defensive line, but where are the Americans going to come? The plan. And again, I am doing kind of the short outline here, so I do apologize for those of you who are more historians of D-Day. But we're going to keep it kind of simple here. We know that there were, of course, 5 invasion beaches. Utah, as Flint had already mentioned, which the 4th Infantry Division was tasked with taking. Omaha, the 1st and the 29th Infantry Divisions, American divisions under 5 Corps, were taking those. And then the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, all the way over here. Now, to hold the flanks, if you will, to the west and to the east, we're going to drop paratroopers. Okay? American paratroopers, 2 divisions, the 82nd Airborne, the All-Americans, the 101st Screaming Eagles. Then over here, the British 6th Airborne Division. We're going to land and take, as you can see how important it would be to kind of hold those flanks. Those airborne units had some other objectives too, which we'll talk about in just a second. But that was the basic plan along the Normandy coast there. Here's something that a lot of people don't consider about this entire event. And that was how important weather was in playing a role in D-Day. It darn near got the thing canceled, which would have been pretty bad news because we're not exactly sure when the Allies would have been able to assemble such a force and be able to pick an opportune moment to try this invasion again had it not succeeded in June. So as we know, the weather in the English Channel can be pretty bad during summer. And early summer here, we had lots of storms, lots of rain, lots of conditions that are not going to be good for moving a whole bunch of invasion ships and men and equipment and material and flying a whole bunch of planes and gliders to drop paratroopers into Normandy. So weathermen, forecasters. You know, the next time you're watching Channel 4, Channel 7, and you're watching the news and you see the forecaster there, maybe give that person a little salute for their work that they do in informing us what the weather is going to be. Because they have lots of tools today that they didn't have back then. And the forecasters who were working for the British and the United States and the military there played a very important role in trying to predict what this weather is going to be, reading the fronts that were coming in over the channel, and making sure that the weather conditions were going to be at least good enough to make this invasion. The entire success of the invasion depended on this weather. And if the forecasts were wrong, think about this. The entire operation could fail. And throughout this time period, in late May and early June of 1944, there were constant storms and rain. So the planners for the first week of June are very frustrated. And so are all of those soldiers sitting in their quarantined camps while they're being rained on, and they just want to go and get this over with. And they can't. They keep being told, canceled, canceled. After canceling due to heavy rain on June 5th, because that was going to be the original date they were going to set out, Eisenhower was told by the meteorologist, look, we got some luck. There's been a quick window of good weather that's going to come in very fast. We have to take advantage of it, or you're going to have to call this whole thing off. And that's when he said the very famous words to his staff, okay, let's go. Let's do it. So it was a gamble. And a very famous photograph here, I'm sure many of you have seen this reproduced many times. Eisenhower went out to speak to some of the troopers with 101st Airborne who were going to go in on that night drop on the evening of June 5th. And his driver, I think her name was Kay Parker, isn't that right? I think his Jeep driver. She had mentioned that Eisenhower went out there to talk to the paratroopers because he wanted to make them feel a little bit more better about this mission. He wanted to set their minds at ease. And he found out the paratroopers had the opposite effect on him. When he's walking around talking to these guys, he, as you can imagine, all of this weight of this invasion on Eisenhower. And he said, these paratroopers are like, we're ready to go, sir. He said, send us in, we're going to get this job done for you. So he said when he walked away from there, he had tears in his eyes. At least that's what his driver said. And that he said to himself that it made him feel a lot more sure that this was going to be a successful endeavor. Oh, by the way, this gentleman right here, who is right above his thumb, his face right there, is Schuyler Jackson, who played a very important role in the defense of Bastogne many months later. That's just a chart kind of showing, again, how huge this endeavor was. And I always like this. I used to show this to my students because it would give them a good graphic idea of what this was about. I'm not sure that we could do something like this today. I don't know. But it was pretty remarkable. So that night, U.S. 101st Airborne Division, 86th Airborne Division, or 82nd, pardon me, were tasked with seizing the towns of Saint-Mère-Église, Carentan, and the bridges over the Douve and Marais rivers. This night drop into the Cotentin Peninsula would helpfully secure the west flank of the beaches for the seaborne assault. And also, they wanted to hold these 4 exits off the beach, Utah Beach there, which was really important for the 4th Infantry Division, General Barton's division. If he's going to move his troops as soon as possible off the beach, the airborne troops were dropped behind the beach there to go ahead and secure those exits and all those areas. And taking these towns was very important too. That was a large part of their mission. The British 6th Airborne Division, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, would secure the left, the eastern flank, and they had the job of taking the Orne River and the canals there, the Caen canals in that region. I'm not going to talk quite as much about the British. I am not an Anglophobe, assure you. But I did want to kind of focus a little bit more on the U.S. involvement in this. So over 13,000 men would be dropped at night. That's pretty dicey. Paratroopers. God bless those paratroopers. And gliders would come in a little bit later in the morning, and they would bring more troops and they would bring supplies and things like that. But these paratroopers were going to have a heck of a time because they are the first Allied troops jumping into Nazi-occupied France. You can imagine that. I did speak with one gentleman who did that, and he said, I asked him, I said, what was going through your mind when you stepped out that door that night? And you looked down there and you knew that those were just Nazis down there. And you were jumping into this black, dark void. And he said, the only thing I could think of was, I want to get the hell out of this plane. Because remember, they were firing up at the plane and everything. So he said, that was the only thought going through my head. I just want to get the hell out of this plane. I didn't even care if my parachute opened. I just want to get the hell out of this plane. So, yeah, and there were, as we've probably seen in the movies, if you've seen like Band of Brothers and shows like that, these U.S. paratroopers were scattered. Many of them landed far from their planned drop zones. They were thrown off course by the anti-aircraft fire, by the weather conditions, by some mistakes that were made in the original Pathfinders setting up landing spots. And this actually kind of worked to the Americans' advantage. It's very interesting because small groups of American paratroopers were landing here and there, all around Normandy. And the Germans didn't know where to go. Where do we fight these American paratroopers when there's 10 over here behind this hill, and there's 5 over here shooting at us behind this river, and there's 6 over here up in this town shooting at us from the windows? And you can imagine the confusion that the Germans were having during this time. So this parachute assault, this airborne assault, actually kind of worked out in some ways, although it was very costly. And the fighting was of a very intense nature, and I recommend an excellent book for that. Flint over here wrote a book called If Chaos Reigns, and it is a great account of what many of these soldiers went through and how intense some of this combat was that night. By morning, many of the objectives had actually been achieved, in particular holding many of these key towns and, of course, these very important exits off the beach from Utah for the seaborne forces to take advantage. Yeah. The same veteran I talked to with the 101st Airborne, and I remember that he told me, he said they had captured a German colonel the next morning, and he was talking to this colonel, and this colonel says, you know, he says, I don't know how to fight you American paratroopers. He says, I don't know what to do. He said, that's because I don't think you guys know what you're doing. Some of you know, of course, the story of Omaha Beach, so I won't go too in depth here, but at Omaha, the 29th Infantry Division, the 1st Infantry Division landed, and this came close to disaster. German defenses in this area were very strong and very resistant. Over 2,400 casualties, most in the first few minutes. Omaha was the beach that had the most casualties. And it was dicey there for a minute. There was even some consideration that perhaps there should be some way of withdrawing the troops here. For a moment, it kind of teetered on the tipping point there. But luckily, thanks to people like General Norman Dutch Coda, who, very interesting comment, he told his troops while he's on the beach, we're being killed on the beaches, let's go inland and be killed. But he was able to move these men off the beach as quick as possible, which was key, because on the beach, they're just getting slaughtered. Robert Capa, some of you know his famous photographs. Now, some of you may also know there's been some very interesting controversy about his photos and some new information that has come to light. So the traditional story, some of you may know, is that Capa stepped off a landing craft accompanying these assault soldiers in the first wave. And he took photographs, and when he got back on a landing craft, because he was a reporter, he was a military journalist, he took the photos, the film, back to be developed, and a worker in the darkroom ruined most of the photos. He had like 100-some shots, and only about 11 came out, and some of them are kind of blurred from the emulsion. But what they found now is they found more information that may not have been the case. Now, this is no This is no criticism of Kappa, because he was very courageous. He had taken war photographs throughout the Spanish Civil War and World War II, and he definitely was a courageous individual. But it's now come to light that perhaps Kappa had lied a little bit, and when he really hit the beach, he only stayed there for a few minutes and really did only rattle off a few photographs, maybe about 10 or 11, and then got the hell out of there. He wanted to make a deadline. But I don't think any of us could also blame him for, since he had a way to get off the beach, wanting to get off the beach too, as fast as possible. But I don't think it's any comment on his courage. I think it was just more, he felt he had done his job and he needed to get out there as quick as possible. Utah, Flint had pretty much talked about this, so I'm not going to mention a whole lot here. But as he had mentioned, Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Went ashore for Barton. Barton came ashore a little bit later, and they landed almost a mile off course from the area they were supposed to land on beaches. But when they got on there, they didn't encounter a whole lot of German resistance. This was like Omaha Beach. There were very few casualties, as a matter of fact. And when some of these subordinate commanders came to Roosevelt and they said, what are we going to do? We landed in the wrong spot. He said, you know what? We'll start the war from right here. Made sense. Instead of trying to move your forces at that point. So that was a good decision on his part. And the only big problem I guess they had right off of Utah was there was a large minefield that gave them a little bit of trouble. And they lost some men there. There were some casualties there. And there were a few problems with linking up with the airborne units that morning, but finally they did. The Germans had flooded a lot of the Cotentin Peninsula. A lot of the area around the Douve River, and this was flooded intentionally. And there are some horrific stories, of course, of some of the paratroopers landing in some of these flooded areas and drowning before they could get out of their harness. Pointe du Hoc, we have one of the most spectacular events on this day of days, and some of you know this story. It is a point of land that stretches out between Utah and Omaha Beach. And the Germans had put 6 large guns up there, 155 millimeter howitzers. And as we'd been doing reconnaissance flights over it, the Americans had figured that this is one of the key areas that must be taken, but it had these huge cliff sides. So this task was given to U.S. Rangers, a 2nd Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder. And this, if you've seen the story, and it's featured, I think, in The Longest Day. I think it's in the movie. This was quite the struggle. They had to go up these 90-foot cliffs. Meanwhile, the Germans are up on top shooting down at them, throwing grenades down on them. Then they had to scale these cliffs with climbing gear, get up to the top, and then they found that the guns had been moved. They were not in their position. Now, in the movie, it makes it look like the guns were totally moved away. And we have one of the soldiers going, this wasn't worth it, and, that kind of thing. But actually, the guns had just been moved further inland. And they were found by the Rangers, and they were destroyed, and they were put out of action. But then the Rangers had to hold this point until the beachheads were secure. And there were a lot of counterattacks by the Germans, and they suffered a lot of casualties. Over 70% of the force of 122 men were killed or wounded by the end of the day.
70%, right?
Yeah, 70%, is that what I said?
You said 7.
Yeah, 70, yeah. Again, I don't want to touch too much on the British and Canadians because we do have primarily an audience here of Americans, but they did their part too, as we know. Gold, Juno, and Sword, especially Juno, was not just a cakewalk. Sometimes we think it was for the British. They had the easy part. Not exactly. Juno, where the Canadians landed, there was some pretty stiff resistance that was put up there. And as they began to drive towards Caen, the German resistance got even worse. There were some SS units that were finally moved in by Hitler when he finally gave the okay to move in some of these units a little bit later, a couple days later, and the city was not captured until July 19th. Free French commando forces also helped secure the resort town of, I think I pronounced this right, Ouistreham?
Yes.
Ouistreham? Okay. And they held this vital strategic flank on the Caen Canal. Liberation of France. So we know heavy fighting took place throughout June to take the port of Cherbourg, the city of Caen, and break out of the bocage, the hedgerow country. See, once we have a foothold in Normandy, once we have this invasion successful, then moving further inland becomes the real challenge. And the challenge here is, if any of you have ever been to Normandy, and still today, it is largely a rural area, lots of farms, and between these farms, some of which have existed for century upon century, are these huge overgrown hedgerows. Okay, and some of these 10, 15 foot tall trees, the roots going down in these embankments that are about 6 feet tall, they created natural walls or barriers. And the Germans put these to use very well for defensive reasons, as you can imagine. So this was tough, breaking through this, but eventually with Operation Cobra, and finally Patton was brought in, because you can imagine he was not having a good time sitting over in Great Britain cooling his heels at this time. But when he is brought in, he leads the Third Army, and they advance quickly in 3 weeks to Lorraine. And then the German frontier, they liberate Paris, August 25th. War was by no means over. There was a lot of hard fighting that would continue in France, Holland, Belgium, and Germany, all the way until VE Day on May 8th. So, the Great Crusade, 9,000 Allied casualties just on that day. German casualties a little bit harder to determine, but I've seen numbers between 6,000 and 9,000 estimate. French civilians too, we also have to remember them too. They paid the price for this, a huge brunt of the war that day. Estimates over 20,000 casualties. What was really tragic was those were mainly from Allied bombing. We weren't intentionally trying to bomb the French, but of course there was no way to bomb some of these strategic areas that we needed to, the cities and villages and areas like that, without the effect of hitting civilians. By the end of this monumental day, Allied forces had established this foothold in France, and the days of Hitler's Third Reich were numbered. So as I think it was Winston Churchill put, this is not the end, and this is not the beginning, but this is the end of the beginning of the end. So, all right. If you get a chance to go there, I was there in 2004, and you have a chance to see Normandy. It is spectacular. The American National Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer is one of the most beautiful cemeteries in the world, if you ask me, and quite a place to reflect upon this cost, this sacrifice that took place on June 6th. And I got a couple of photos here when I was there in 2004. There's a former sergeant of mine I served with in the Army, and we're on Omaha Beach. I think that's at Easy Green. That's where we were. St. Mary-Glise. And then I put this one in here especially for Flint, because that's Flint and I. Many years ago, we first met. I don't think we even knew each other, and we were at the 1940s ball. But I thought he'd get a kick out of that picture. Yeah. Anyway. So thank you. Flint and I are going to take some questions if you guys have any about D-Day.
Eisenhower's driver was an Irish woman named Kay Summersby,
That was it.
and her husband had been killed in the war. I'm not sure what unit he was with, but there were always rumors that Ike and Kay had something going, but there's no proof of that. So anybody have a question, a comment, a correction on my pronunciation of anything? Terry.
You know, I read a book, and unfortunately I can't tell you the name of it, but there was a reporter, a German reporter, that had gone to the Normandy coast before the invasion and had interviewed with the idea of publishing the men that were on the Atlantic Wall.
Yeah.
Her name was Maureen Sweeney. She snuck on. She was the only woman that was on the island.
Oh.
She wasn't, in fact, her husband, she was married to Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, okay. Didn't know about that.
Wait, did you say it was a German
No,
woman?
this was a German reporter
German reporter.
that was reporting on the Normandy coast.
Okay.
And it didn't happen, the publication didn't happen. And his son went back many years later and looked up some of the men that he had reported. And one of the comments that stuck out in the book for me was, as the invasion was happening and the Germans were looking out, one of them commented, "Where are the horses?" And the Germans expected that, just like their army was moved by horses, they didn't understand the mechanization of the US and British allies army. I thought that was really an interesting.
That'd be good to find out the name of
I
that
got it
book.
from my dentist, and he and I trade books. We have a private book club.
That's a great idea, though.
He had this book, and it was a phenomenal book. I can find the name.
Yeah, we'd like to see that, yeah.
Does he give you a discount on your teeth cleaning?
No, unfortunately, he wasn't. He's trying to retire. So.
Oh, okay.
I have read that the Germans were convinced that on that day it would be overcast and there would be no invasion.
Yeah.
Going along with that, Rommel's wife's birthday is on June 6th. So he planned, and he did go back to Germany, and he was not there for the invasion.
Yep.
And
Right.
he was the whole conductor of the defense.
Yeah,
And that was one reason why the tanks were not brought up until the U.S. had established a good foothold, because until then, if the tanks had been brought up when Rommel wanted to bring them up and had gotten Hitler's permission, because he was probably the only guy to get Hitler's permission, that Omaha Beach may have been a disaster rather than any success.
yeah. Well, some of the other German commanders were also away from their headquarters in Normandy. Some were at war games in, I think it was Rennes. There was another general who was spending the weekend with his mistress in Paris. And so there were a lot of key individuals, decision makers, who couldn't make any decisions because they weren't there. Gary?
I think it was in The Longest Day that the Germans were convinced that Patton was going to be the leader of the invasion. And so they thought that Normandy was a distraction, and they didn't send the reinforcements
Yeah, it
a
was-
day or two.
They thought that Normandy was just a diversionary aspect, and that the real invasion would come.
And we played into
From
that
Dover.
too, as you've probably seen, like in the movie The Longest Day, they had like paratrooper dummies that they were dropping out of airplanes in certain select areas to give the impression that maybe we're doing an airborne drop over here and not the real thing over here. There was one German commander that was there, and I kind of feel sorry for this guy. You read about him. He was in charge of the 6th German Fallschirmjäger Division, which was a German paratrooper division. So paratroopers fighting paratroopers, that was kind of dicey stuff. But he was a colonel, Colonel von der Heide, I think.
Yeah, Van der Heide.
Yeah, and he was kind of stuck with this whole thing himself, and he was a colonel, and he's trying to hold all these towns and everything with just a division, and actually it wasn't even a full division complement of German troops. Because most of the troops that they had, many of the troops that were in charge of the Atlantic seawall defenses were kind of what they would call third-rate troops. They were conscripted Poles and Czechs and Russians and people like that.
There were even some Mongolians.
Yes, yeah, they weren't the most dependable,
No.
as far as fighting for the Third Reich and everything like that.
Yeah.
Tom, you had a question back there, sorry.
I just want to make a comment that where the U.S. cemeteries are at, in Europe, France, Belgium, that is sovereign U.S. territory.
Yes.
And they have given us that as an appreciation. But where is our cemeteries for the French in our revolution?
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
I mean, it's just an interesting fact.
Yeah, yeah.
Don, are you aware, what was going on the Eastern Front? Or when this was going on? Was there any coordination were the Soviets invading the eastern side and to try to convince them that, hey,
The Russians at this point, the
Yeah.
Soviets were in Ukraine, weren't they, by this time? And I think
Well,
they were moving on the Polish border.
There was an operation called Operation Bagration, which was the Soviet Army, I think it was the 21st of June, after the Americans and Brits and French had gotten established in Normandy. Then there was this massive 1 million man attack across a 1,000-mile front from the east to the west. And that was their response to what we were doing. So now you got the Germans, front and back, the enemy attacking them. And it really spelled the end. It took 11 more months for the end to come, but it was
But
still.
that's remarkable, I think, 11 months to undo what had taken 4 years for
Yeah.
the Nazis to
Yeah.
expand.
Well, and the Soviets who got up to, by August, they got into Warsaw, and that's a whole nother story too, of course. But it shows you how quick they were moving on the Eastern Front, probably because of now the Second Front opening up finally, in France. So.
Yeah. Back here at the back.
Just as a question, because I've always thought about this a lot. Did the Germans even have a chance in Normandy? I mean, going against this 5,000 ship invasion force?
I would say probably not. A whole lot of things went right for the Allies and a whole lot of things went wrong for the Germans. Had those situations, changed, then probably the Germans had a chance of defeating the invasion. But, we can look at the what ifs and realize that, didn't work out quite that way.
Such is the nature of war, right?
Yeah.
You look back through all history, even back to antiquity, and sometimes it just pinwheels on something as simple as like Rommel being out of the area at that time. Or
For want of a nail, a horse
right,
was liable.
right.
This gentleman here.
Well, I think the other part of that is the deception that the invasion was going to be at Khalid. What was so important to our advances that we made all along the front.
Yeah, the deception plan was one of the great aspects of the whole operation. Ooh, more hands. We'll go here, and then we'll work our way back.
I believe Hitler's original plan was to just do one front at a time. He and England had the Battle of Britain, and he was expecting to win that, but he didn't. Therefore, he sent everything to the east to start with Russia before he had finished with England. So he had England in the background with America backfilling with troops. So that gave him two fronts to worry about.
Yeah, that's right.
So by the time June 6th came around, most of his best troops were actually on the Eastern Front, my understanding. Because they were more afraid of the Russians than anybody else.
Let's go with this lady in the back here.
So I'm French, I'm probably the only French here. Just to let you guys know that I grew up with my grandmother's story, who at the time was living through the German occupation. And you can't believe how much relief there were, the civilians, when the Americans came. Finally, the Americans came. So I grew up with her stories, always, and up to today, France is very grateful, but also very sad about the number of men that died that day. So I would not be here today without the Americans.
Thank you. Thank you. Vive la France!
And to kind of tag on to that real quick, if I could just share a quick story, and you might be interested in this, Beatrice. When I was over there, I heard a story about an American paratrooper veteran who was over during the 2004 celebration of D-Day. And he and his wife were walking around. He was, an elderly gentleman, and he wandered into this field. I don't know, it was a farmer's field of rye or something like that. He was trying to find the place where he had parachuted down that night with the airborne. And he's wandering around with his wife. He's looking around, and all of a sudden, out of one of the little farmhouses, this French farmer, Norman farmer, comes running out, yelling at him in French, get out of my field, get out of my farm field, this kind of stuff. And he goes, oh, I am very sorry, monsieur. I didn't mean to be trampling through your crop and all this kind of stuff. And he said, but I was just trying to find the place where I landed on June 6th when I parachuted here. And this farmer's total attitude changed. He said, oh, my God, thank you, sir. And he says, merci beaucoup. He invited him into his house. He gave him and his wife drinks of Calvados, which is a very strong liquor if you've ever had it. He fed him dinner. His family invited him for dinner. And all he could say that night was just how much he appreciated the Americans and what they had done to liberate France. So I love that story. It was
The last thing I will say is, I grew up with the Atlantic Wall on the beach because I was on the beach. There's still the Atlantic Wall. There are bunkers, still German bunkers everywhere today.
Yep.
And of course, I grew up with you're not allowed to go in the bunker because there's still ammunition that we found even today. But the wall is collapsing right now, but it's still there.
Oh, yeah, it'll probably be there longer than the pyramids. Yeah.
To
John?
piggyback on what you said about French gratitude, and I don't know if you visited Normandy. I was there a year ago. But I took a bicycle trip along there above the beaches. And there are individual markers for individual U.S. men who were killed or units throughout that. So the French have just done a tremendous job of honoring our lost soldiers.
They have. Jim?
In St. Mary Eglise, did you see the dummy soldier
Yes.
hanging from the steeple?
Hanging from the church.
John Steele.
John Steele, yeah.
Although there's a question of which side of the steeple he's on.
Right.
It was on
He's
originally.
on a more visible side, yes.
Shar?
I wanted to say something too. We have a French family that I have known the mother since she was 17. She's now 48 years old. She has 8 children. She was honored by the Pope for those many children. But 2 years ago, they all took the family and the children through those sites because they are so grateful for their, for what the U.S. did.
Yeah.
And that's, but I'm glad she's mentioned something because it's good to hear that good news too.
That's right. Yeah. Lady here?
Thank you. Don, could you use that, since I was born after World War II happened, and I'm not real familiar with D-Day, could you show us on that map where the beaches are and where
Normandy.
the Germans thought we were coming?
So right here where this red arrow is coming here,
Okay.
and I believe the Pas-de-Calais is right there. So you can see how close it is to, I don't think this map is actually the best scale, but it still is very close there, so yeah. And this is where Patton was over in this part of Dover, so they thought he was going to come across there.
Okay.
So yeah, and down here is where it actually
Where we
came.
actually came, okay. I think I had an uncle that was in the Battle of the Bulge, but never heard of
There was also some thought that I believe part of Operation Fortitude was to make the Germans think for a while that we might invade Norway. Too.
Right. Yeah. Gentleman in back.
One of the things that I was told was chain of command, that the German enlisted weren't able to really give orders where the American, a corporal could give an order to a private or something, and that's when officers were killed, then enlisted people would take over, whereas Germans were not able to do that. Any truth to that?
I think the Germans were more rigid in who could give orders to someone else. And there wasn't, I don't think within, I'm part Austrian, I don't think in the German mentality there was a culture of questioning authority. If somebody told you to jump off the cliff, you jumped off the cliff. And if you saw something that was going wrong, you weren't necessarily free to point that out to somebody who might be your superior. So I think there's some truth to what you mentioned.
I think also it was a matter of training because U.S. troops were trained to take initiative.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were, if if there was a leadership vacuum, the corporal takes charge.
Especially as paratroopers, you read accounts, like in Flint's book, where, one NCO, a buck sergeant, lands, he collects a private or two with them, and they start waging their own war. And I don't think the German army, the big problem was flexibility, I think. Being able to react to certain situations, because they were so structured, they had difficulty with that. Whereas the Americans, they were almost like born with this flexible idea of how do I react under this type of situation.
Yeah.
Well, a later example of that is the bridge at Raymond and the capture of that bridge that happened almost immediately once they discovered it.
Yeah.
And
That's
that
right.
was a field decision.
Yeah, move quick.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have two more questions. Bear, let's go with you.
Well, I just want to make the comment that a couple of the, in my opinion, most overlooked aspects of not just this massive operation, but the entire war in Europe is the importance, number one is the importance of Operation Ultra, which was kept so secret, was probably the best kept secret of World War II.
You know about Ultra?
Well, I'll explain a little bit about it. It was the people at a place called Bletchley Park, about an hour train ride north of London, who were a part of the interception of all German radio communications during the war, which were encoded by a ciphering machine called the Enigma. Probably heard of the Enigma. They were, the very first electronic computer was developed at Bletchley Park, which speeded up the deciphering of the German codes and the messages that they were sending. So we were reading their mail. It was an intensive counterintelligence operation going on both sides. The Germans, we knew that about the Germans, but they didn't have the deciphering capability that the US and British had at Bletchley Park. So we played into their intelligence gathering operation. One thing you guys didn't talk about was not only inflatable tanks, which everybody can understand that, reconnaissance flights showing all these armored vehicles and artillery pieces and encampments, which you described very well, Don. But they developed an entire radio network for the first U.S. Army group, which didn't exist. That was Patton's army that didn't exist. They were constantly sending the same kinds of messages that would go out about disposition of your troops, reports on how many people are sick, all that kind of stuff. They created this entire false, encoded, the Germans were able to decode, and it gave the impression that this army was in actual existence. It was very convincing.
Keep in mind that Enigma was broken even before the war started by the Polish.
Yes.
I just had to get the
That's right. Don's Polish, so he's got to get in a plug for them.
But they were the ones who originally broke the code, and then, of course, they gave it to what they called Ultra, which was kind of like the collection of it. But you're very right, Bear. I mean, it was because we had that ability to read their mail, as you said, that gave us an advantage.
I'll just add to the Ultra story. There are a lot of good books about, one is Breaking the Enigma and so on. And I've been to Bletchley Park a couple of times. It's very interesting. They've recreated some of these machines, which were all destroyed after the war. But there were enough people that were still around, sworn to secrecy. Finally, when they took the secret wraps off, they've recreated some of the machines, and they have people that actually work there that will give you a tour and describe how the machines actually work. So it was a very complex system. They came up with ways of breaking the codes. They would have, for instance, special sheets of very thin cardboard that were punched with holes, and then they were stacked, and they looked for where the light shone through on a light table from down below, and that would be a coincidence of the letter on the keyboard of the Enigma machine and the letter that actually hit the paper to print out the different letter, the encoded letter. And they would spend hundreds of hours doing that, 24 hours a day. And eventually, they computerized the process.
Yeah. Last question, the lady in the VFW hat.
But Conrad, we have to keep in mind, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, so he wasn't even alive during this.
Well, that was a year later, 30th, 45.
1945.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that's about it for questions, but Don and Flint will be here if you have any further questions. I'd like to also remind everybody that Monday, Memorial Day, we're going to have a celebration at the Commons Park here in Broomfield. It'll be the Memorial Day. We'll have honor guard, music, hot dogs and hamburgers will be for sale there by the Rotary. And we'll have some reenactors there also. That's on Monday, and then the following month on June 15th, we'll have our Flag Day, which will have another celebration here on the front lawn. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.